Screen. Good evening. When I was 13 years old, I was standing in my mother's kitchen in rural Kansas with my grandmother. We were cooking. This is a woman who taught me everything in her repertoire, how to make a perfect pie crust, a duck confit that still knocks foodies in San Francisco off their feet 40 years later. And that day, we were making a stock, which we had made hundreds of times together before. And I handed her a chinois. And for anybody in here who's a chef, they know that that is a large cylinder cone that you use to strain the stock. She stared at it in confusion. She didn't know what to do. She was later diagnosed with dementia. But it was the beginning of my interest in the human brain and wanting to understand how this organ that lives up here in my skull contributes to who I am, my identity, my use of language, what makes me uniquely human, my ability to remember, pay attention, think, and plan in a way that is uniquely human. And I decided then and there that I wanted to be a brain doctor of some sort when I grew up. I didn't know what that meant at 13. And 30 years later, I found that cognition and its role in health was once again at the center of my life when my husband was struck by a car while he was riding his bike in San Francisco, and he suffered spinal injury and traumatic brain injury. And we needed cognitive data as part of the requirement for his treatment planning and couldn't get access to it. And the deep irony was I was no longer a lost little 13-year-old girl. I was a clinical neuropsychologist doing a fellowship in neuroimaging. My boss at the time was the president of the American Psychiatric Association, a man named Alan Schatzberg. And I couldn't get access easily and affordably to the exact kind of tests that I provided every day to my patients and that my husband so desperately needed. And this was the beginning of a journey for me to found a company called Savonix. And I'm not going to talk about Savonix, though, today. I'm going to talk about why I'm doing this. And that why is actually really critically important when we think about all of us, because we did some market research recently, and we found that 98% of respondents would rather lose a limb, become quadriplegic, go blind, than experience cognitive decline. Why do you think that is? It's because who we are, everything, right, is in the brain. It is who we are. It is our ability. It is our unique humanness that lives inside of our brain. So how many people in here know their blood pressure? Show of hands. Anybody got some numbers? This is my number at my last measurement. I'm going to give you my stats. Some of the doctors in the room are going to be looking at this going, how healthy is she? What about your LDL cholesterol? Anybody? Couple hands. Some of the older folks that are getting it measured regularly, right? Over 40. Doctors wanting to know this number now. What about your pulse, your resting pulse? This is really mine. Yeah, me too. Know it too. What about your respiration? Anybody know their respirate? I didn't know this one either. I actually had to count it to get it up on the slide for this. What about your working memory? Anybody? Yeah, I know mine. That's because I have Savonix. It's at the 85.4th percentile, which is good. That means it's in the high average range. Although when I didn't get sleep the night before like today, not so much. So why is this important? I talk about and I write about often cognition as the fifth vital sign, the vital that is ignored. We talk a lot in medicine about pulse, blood pressure, respiration rate, cholesterol, and all these numbers are important. But it turns out that they're not nearly as important as our cognition. So neuropsychologists have known for about 80 years how to accurately measure cognition with task-based metrics. It's actually relatively easy to do. And if we think of BUN as the normative measurable output of the kidney, and ALT as the normal measurable output of the liver, we can think of things like attention, executive function, and working memory as the normative measurable output of the brain. But why is this more important than these other numbers? Well, as it turns out, if my working memory is impaired right now, I can't give a talk to you. If my cholesterol is high, that's bad, that's not great, but I can probably still drive my car home tonight and go about my life. I can still do what my doctor asks me to do because I can pay attention and I can think and I can plan and I can remember. But if my cognition is impaired, overnight, that can change. And I'm sure many of the physicians in the audience have seen that happen in their patients. I know I have seen it happen in my patients. Postoperative delirium, cognitive impairment secondary to thyroid disorder, secondary to diabetes, secondary to cardiovascular disease, secondary to chemotherapy. And in fact, cognition emerges as a top 3 predictor of treatment outcome in a multitude of diseases that I'm going to present data on in a minute. But the reason that it's so important to us day to day is because it's how we get along, how we remember the grocery list when we're in the store, how we drive a car, how we do simple math in our head to make change. Oh, if you can do that, although the last few people at the grocery store didn't do a very good job. But let's take a look at cognition in these different diseases. 50%, almost 50% of diabetic patients fail at treatment. This is not a new statistic to most of the physicians in the room. But when you look in clinical trials, it gets really interesting. In one study, it was found that there was a 70% reduction in glucose monitoring behavior for patients with mild cognitive impairment. But what's interesting is how mild it was. It still fell within the average range. So the average range, for instance, of attention encompasses roughly the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile. And for these patients that were in the lower end of the average range, the 20th to 30th percentile, they were monitoring their glucose at 70% less rate than those patients at the high end of the average cognitive function for working memory, executive function, and attention. This means that and when we talk about the average range, it means if you're sitting with that patient in a room, you're not going to notice a problem. They don't seem cognitively impaired. These are subtle and small changes, often secondary to the disease. It gets more interesting. 11% of assisted living residents have COPD, and COPD has an increased risk of cognitive impairment, 3-fold risk of cognitive impairment risk. In depression, there's an 85% rate of cognitive impairment with the disease. And what's really interesting about depression is that with SSRIs, often the cognitive symptoms are alleviated first prior to the mood symptoms. Many times patients will quit treatment because the mood symptoms aren't getting better. But if we monitor cognition, we can show them that things are getting better and we can help them stick with treatment longer. So there's a lot of ways in which cognition has a role to play in treatment. It's also implicated in kidney disease, cardiovascular health, and 75% of cancer patients experience cognitive impairment. 35% of them continue to have cognitive impairment after treatment is discontinued. So this isn't just chemo brain. There's something else going on here. And then, of course, there's dementia, which might be the health problem that cripples the world economy. If you've been following the headlines recently about the problems that we're facing globally, this will be the next pandemic. And we can see with the recent treatment failures of Eli Lilly and Axivant that we're probably not going to make great strides in the late stages of the disease anytime in the near future. What we have to do is we have to screen everybody in the community the way we screen for blood pressure. We have to detect early, and we have to intervene early with the lifestyle factors that we know can impact this disease. Things like exercise, remaining socially engaged, diet, and sleep. So let's take a look at some treatment outcomes. So if you look in stroke patients, even when rehabilitation is successful, you see a huge impact of cognition on treatment outcomes. Cognitive impairment in heart disease predicts a 7.5 greater risk of readmission to the hospital and death. And in diabetes, you have a 20% higher mortality rate for patients with diabetes who also have even mild cognitive impairment, the kind of cognitive impairment I was talking about before. So earlier this summer, my 94-year-old aunt fell and fractured her pelvis. So when I got that phone call, every doctor in the room knows that the first thing I thought was, uh-oh, this is it, right? Aunt Juanita's gonna die. She's 94 years old, and she fractured her pelvis. This is really pretty severe. So my mother's in the hospital with her, and I'm on the phone with my mom. And my aunt Juanita, put her on the phone. I was making plans to go, because they live together in rural Kansas, an 80-year-old woman and a 94-year-old woman. And my Aunt Juanita gets on the phone and she goes, "You're planning to come visit?" And I said, "Yes." And she goes, "You think I'm gonna die. I'm not gonna die. You have a company to run. Stay there." Okay. I go to visit 4 weeks later on a planned trip. I get out of the car and there's my Aunt Juanita 4 weeks post-op, gardening. And she looks at me and she goes, "See, not dead." And I was like, for heaven's sakes. But her story is really important. She's a 5-time cancer survivor at 94. And she was considered a good risk for her surgery. Why? I can tell you why. Her cognition is all in the high average range. I know, I monitor her every 6 months. If you had a conversation with her, you would think she was 50 years old. And yes, she still drives. I ride with her and she's safer than most people I see on the roads here. In fact, her surgeon told me that they normally wouldn't have done the surgery in a 94-year-old woman, but because of her cognitive capacity, they felt very strong about her ability to take care of herself, and she had better outcomes than people 30 years younger than her. She was discharged to home, and 4 weeks later, she was gardening. So she's a really good case example of what I've shown here statistically in this slide around cognitive risk and falls. So it's not just that if you're cognitively impaired, you're more likely to fall. It's actually if you are older and you have a fall and a fracture, you have a 22% chance of having a cognitive impairment secondary to that fracture. I love to talk about cognition in diabetes because it's such a great case example of the role that cognition can play in diabetes, in a disease case. So 47% of people fail to successfully manage their diabetes. Nobody in here is probably surprised by that number. If we can reduce treatment failure in diabetes, we can impact 1.4 million lives. And of course, treatment failure in diabetes is ugly. It's end-stage renal failure, it's blindness, it's amputation. It looks really ugly, and of course, it doesn't show up until it's so bad, right? The thing about high blood sugar is, unlike impaired cognition, you can live with it for a long time and not really notice you have a problem until you have a really severe problem. So, what do you do with it? I find out my patient is cognitively impaired. This is actually Savonix results for a patient who's been de-identified with diabetes who has extremely low information processing speed. So that means they're going to talk and think a lot slower than I do because I tend to go fast. They have very poor working memory, which is a huge issue in managing diabetes. And they also have poor executive function. So what you see here are their results, the way that we present them to the clinician. And these are the kinds of guidelines that we would provide for a physician if they were treating this patient. So speak slowly and provide written collateral if they have processing speed issues. Set up a system of reminders if they have poor working memory, whether that's using social support within the family, calendar reminders, an app, whatever it is. And provide step-by-step instructions for poor executive function. You have to tell them, go from A to B to C to D. You can't just tell the person like this that they have to get from A to E. Because you're not going to be able to do that on their own. That's executive function, and if it's impaired, they won't be able to work that process out on their own. And this breaks it out looking at in treatment planning. So you've got a diagnosis, you have a cognitive assessment, which, by the way, the American Diabetes Association recommends that every single diabetic patient receive a cognitive assessment. It's just not practical because there's only 907 board-certified neuropsychologists in the US and Canada. So this is what we do. We assess that there is poor cognition, and the physician can focus on ways to improve treatment adherence with case management, written instructions, family support, education programs, apps like ShopWell, which is just great. You can put your diagnosis of diabetes in and they can scan food labels and it will tell them if they can eat it or not. There's a lot of things that you can do to help people with poor cognition and manage their disease. If the patient is capable of self-managing, that's great. They should be allowed to do it. These are some recent headlines taking a look at what I would call the medical community waking up to the fact that this is a vital that we ignore. In fact, your brain right now is operating all your other organs, right? It's responsible for making sure that kidneys function, and your heart beats, everything. It's doing all of it. It is the motherboard of the body. And yet we fly blind every day with our patient around the vital function of this organ. So what does that all mean? Well, healthier patients and longer lives. I dream of a world where cognition is measured at each visit, not just because my company does that, but because I've seen the power of it in my own personal life. Where we track cognition over time and compare it to baseline. I'll give you a really good example. When my husband had traumatic brain injury, and I tested him, all of his cognitive function was in the average range. And his doctor was like, see, there's not a problem. No, wrong. He had been my guinea pig when I was training to do the testing, and I had baseline data on him, and I was able to show over 120% percentile point drop across 4 domains of cognition, which shocked his physicians and caused them to think about his treatment completely differently. Early detection of cognitive impairment, and also comparative baselines. And optimizing treatment plan according to cognitive ability. Because brain health is overall health. And I'm happy to take your questions. I'll repeat the question. Yes.
Dr. Charvat, you had a wonderful presentation, learned a lot. I wanted to know how you compute the working memory.
So that's a percentile score based on, there's two ways that you can compute a normative score. One is a pure regression method and the other is a group-based means. At Savonix we use group-based means, which is a pretty standard approach. So you have a normative sample based on age. Yes?
Thank you. What are some insights with working with physicians to get them to adopt this new mindset and to actually use the product?
So the question is, what are some ways to work with physicians around a mindset to get them to adopt the product? That's a challenge. Physicians are busy. Unlike a lot of psychologists, I grew up and was trained in medical centers, not community mental health centers. And many of my clinical team also trained in busy medical centers. So I think it's really about being sensitive to workflow, providing really good training and support so that they can easily read the results and implement them smoothly into treatment planning.
One question is in cognition, you said about baselining it, right? But with the age, I think the memory also goes down. So how often it has to be measured?
So the question is, if you take a baseline and you think about aging, how do you track changes when someone's aging? So the way that, just like there's normative function for your kidney when you're 10 versus when you're 40 versus when you're 80, guess what? Same thing for your brain. We've been doing it for 80 years. There are very, very well-established norms that are driven by age. In fact, when you look at cognition, not IQ, IQ is a cultural construct of what the brain has learned or knows, and it's very culturally loaded. And it's driven by things like gender and access to education. Cognition isn't. Our normative data, for instance, in China and other cultures look exactly like it does in the US. It doesn't vary by education or race or gender, but it does vary by age as the brain develops, as it plateaus, and then as some of us are experiencing already, it slowly starts to do this. So even my 94-year-old aunt who has above average working memory, she had above average working memory when she was 45, I would guess as well, and probably when she was 10. It's just that the score that gets her that percentile is adjusted based on age. And so this is something that's been done over the last 80 years, and it's very well understood. Yes?
To that point, does your system have applications in the pediatric space or for cognitive development rather than decline?
The question is, does our application have relevance in the pediatric space as well as cognitive decline? We normed it in a nationwide sample of persons age 6 to over 90. So yes. Yes?
If you see decline, what can you do to improve it or to stop it?
This is the scary question right now, isn't it? If you see decline, what can you do to improve it or stop it? First of all, you've got to figure out if it's secondary to another medical condition. So even if you're an 80-year-old and you fail, just completely bomb our assessment, I'm not ready to call dementia. What if you have a thyroid condition? What if you develop diabetes and have it's untreated? Or what if you have developed a tumor? There's a lot of things. So you have to always rule out a general medical condition that can cause the cognitive impairment. And in fact, most cognitive impairment is secondary to another medical condition. So that would be the first thing. And then treat that condition and monitor and see if it improves. But there are the big four that have been shown over time and time and time to impact cognitive, and it's not lumosity and it's not crossword puzzles. It is physical exercise. It is a Mediterranean diet. It is adequate sleep so that your glial cells can do their busy little job of cleaning up plaque, which they only do when you're sleeping. And it is face-to-face social interaction. And that is very important. It has to be face-to-face social interaction. Facebook does not count. Chatbots do not count. They do not count because when I am looking at you and I'm reading your response to me, Uli, and you're nodding, my brain is so busy taking in, it has learned over millions of years of evolution to read other people. And it's a very, very complicated thing for my brain to read another person or read all of you. And it exercises it in a way that no crossword puzzle or Facebook interaction ever will. So socialization, diet, sleep, and move. And by the way, there are really good studies that show if you move an hour every day in midlife, it has huge, huge preventative effects around dementia. So I encourage everybody in this room, I exercise. If I run a startup and work 80 hours a week and I work out an hour a day, every one of you can too. Yes? When? I did not last night, but that was just because I had bad insomnia. But yes, I tend to go to bed at 9 o'clock and wake up at about 5. Yes?
So when you say that cognitive impairment is typically secondary to other conditions,
Mm-hmm.
can you explain a little bit about how that process works and what about those other conditions actually impairs your cognitive function?
I am not a metabolic disease expert, nor am I a cardiologist. My job has always been to identify the impairment and then to look at whether or not it had a relationship to the disease state in question, whether it was a standalone cognitive impairment. And usually how we find that out is simply by treating, if there is a cardiovascular disease, if there is diabetes, we treat the primary medical diagnoses and then we measure cognition. And if it's improved when the disease is under control, for instance, diabetes is well managed, then we would call it as that was secondary to the disorder. If it doesn't improve, there's still a chance it was secondary, but it just simply didn't improve with treatment. You do see different kinds of cognitive patterns in different diseases. In depression, you just see an overall blunting of all cognition. Processing speed slows down. Processing speed is the most sensitive domain. It's very sensitive to change, to sleep deprivation, for instance. But working memory and executive function are also sensitive to environmental factors. Yes?
Is there an looked into autism?
Sorry, I got 2 questions at once. Have we looked into autism? Not specifically, no. We're not a disease-specific company. We're a cognitive company.
Is there an application in head injury in athletes?
Is there an application in head injury in athletes? Yes. So what you would want to do is you'd want to get a baseline. And then if you had an event, you'd want to measure. And if you saw effects, you'd want to measure again. So monitor over time. Yeah. Okay, yes?
Have you seen any rehabilitation professionals use your service, especially occupational therapists and speech pathologists?
So the question is, have we seen rehabilitation professionals use our technology, occupational therapists, physical therapists? Not yet, but we're negotiating about 3 contracts right now in that space because that's actually my passion, given what happened to my husband, and given the implications of cognition in physical medicine and rehabilitation and occupational health. There is a CPT code to support reimbursement of our test for occupational therapy, physical therapy, and physical medicine. Yes?
Once we identify that there is a cognitive impairment, like it's coming down, is there any way to restore or back it up?
So the question is, if you identify a cognitive impairment, is there any way to restore it? If it's secondary to a medical condition, again, often treating the medical condition will restore cognition. If it's not, it's lifestyle factors and adjusting those lifestyle factors. That's about the best we can do right now. I mean, I think everybody knows that the treatment trials in phase 3 in Alzheimer's and dementia have been less than promising in the last 2 to 3 years. Okay, thank you for having me.